Hi, everybody. Welcome. I am Tony Gale. I'm a Sony Artisan of Imagery. Many of you have probably seen me before. And today I'm going to be doing part of a lesson and critique series, Speedlights on Location. So what that means, and we'll get into more detail in a minute, and again at the end, is if you have used Speedlights on location and you want me to see your work and talk about it potentially next week, there's going to be an email address. Send it to that email address, and we'll take a look. So I mentioned I'm a Sony Artisan of Imagery. I want to thank Sony and the B&H Event Space for having me on. Without both of them, this doesn't happen. I'm also a BenQ ambassador, a Manfrotto ambassador, and an X-Rite Colorado. And I'm a commercial photographer based here in New York City. I do primarily people and portraits for a variety of editorial, corporate, and advertising clients. Coming up next week, we have part 2 of today, which is a critique of work that you all submit using Speedlights on location. Following that, the following week, we're going to do a lesson and critique series, the second part of it, which is experimenting with photography. I think many of us, as we get more experience, we forget to play with photography, and I think that's important. And then the week after that will be a critique of images that people have done experimenting with photography. And that's all I've got scheduled right now. We'll see what else I can come up with and what'll happen. Besides me, there's a ton of cool stuff coming up with Sony and the B&H Event Space. Looks like tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, Alpha 7R5 with the 51.4. Some of my stuff, Thibaut Roland is doing the art of black and white photography. There's Sony F4 lenses with Mahesh Thepa. There's time-lapse stuff with Andrew Geraci. Andrew is a really excellent time-lapse photographer. Mahesh again, ideal Sony cameras. And then Mahesh a third time with essential features to look for in a compact digital camera. So there's probably other stuff coming up too, but this is what's up right now. The price can't be beat. Also, as I mentioned every time, Sony has a few groups. The Sony Alpha Female Facebook group is a great community. Every week they do a $500 micro grant to somebody who submits an image based on a specific theme and judged by someone. You do not have to identify as female to enter for the micro grant or to be part of the group. And it's a very welcoming group. When people ask questions, people are nice. Additionally, Sony has Alpha Universe, alphauniverse.com. It's a great resource if you want to know more about photography or Sony. Even if you don't shoot Sony cameras, there's a lot of great information about photography, how people did different things, a lot of inspiring stuff. And actually, does it have the date here? Soon, it's on Alpha Universe. There's an Alpha community event in San Francisco. I just learned about it today. It's free, but you should register if you're in the Bay Area. Check it out. All the info is on alphauniverse.com. Alpha Universe is also a great place to see what special deals there may be on Sony product. Of course, you can also look at B&H. Here, though, you can see all the deals broken out and then go to B&H to buy them. Among other things, Xperia phones, Pro I is the phone I use. And, of course, the Sony Alpha Universe forums, also available through Alpha Universe, also a friendly bunch of people. All right, so we are in an exciting time to be photographers. There's a lot of craziness, too. I don't want to gloss over that, but what is available to us in terms of technology is absolutely incredible. And I know I talk about this almost every talk I do, but I do really believe it. The speed with which we can learn, the speed with which we can experiment is so fast now. Photographers who want to can get much better, much quicker than was possible in the past. Plus, there's things that just weren't possible. I'm going to be talking about Speedlights. Speedlights used to be something like the Vivitar 283, which was a workhorse, a great speedlight, but you had to turn a dial on it to tell it what f-stop you were shooting at. And then you had to look at the distance between your subject and the camera, and then base it on the dial and set your camera and ISO based on, well, you didn't set your ISO because it was whatever film you had in the camera, but set all these things and then use this dial. And if you were wrong, if it was too far or too close, it might be off. You don't have to do any of that now. The technology is absolutely incredible. All right, so Speedlites on location. Start with, as I promised, if you would like your work to be considered, and I encourage everybody to submit, send no more than 3 images. Here are all the specs. There's one question from Elizabeth Murphy. Do you have to be a Sony user to go to those sites you mentioned? You do not. You don't even have to own a camera, but if you shoot with another brand, that's fine. Honestly, everybody's making good cameras. I think Sony is making the best camera for most people, but probably not for everybody. And absolutely anyone can go to any of those sites. I think they'll be useful. You don't have to shoot Sony to be on the Alpha Universe forums, or to be in the Sony Alpha Female Facebook group, or even to attend that event in San Francisco. Anyone can attend. All right. So to submit, and you don't have to shoot Sony to submit work either, to be clear. No more than 3,000 pixels on the long side, no less than 12,000 pixels on the short side. You're going to send it to eventspacereviews@gmail.com. Gmail's going to take a look. It is a family-friendly website, so if the imagery you're creating isn't PG, it may not make it to the review process. Also, depending on how many people submit work, we may or may not get to everybody. I'll do my best, but if it's a crazy amount, it just may not be possible. And I'm going to have this slide up again at the end, but if anybody wants to just take a picture of it, all this info is also on the event space page for the event next week. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. So why Speedlites? Now, some of this I talked about a week or 2 ago when I did splashes and pours with Sony Speedlites. But some of the pros of Speedlites: they're small and portable. You know, a Speedlight compared to a bigger strobe, it's a fraction of the size. You can put a ton in your bag. It's going to be less powerful than a studio strobe or a big monolight. So everything's a trade-off, but they're small and portable. They typically run on AA batteries, which means that if you run out of batteries pretty much anywhere in the world with a store, you can get new batteries and be up and going again. You're not limited by a proprietary battery that maybe you forgot the charger for. They're relatively inexpensive compared to a bigger strobe. Super fast flash duration, which we mentioned last week or 2 weeks ago, whenever it was, with the Speedlites for splashes and pours. Flash duration is what helps you freeze motion. Certainly all the Sony Speedlights, most other Speedlights, if you're using another brand, are going to have TTL, which is through the lens metering, and HSS, which is high speed sync. If you're going with a different brand, or if you're going with an older flash, it's possible that they won't have one or both of those things. I can't say for sure because I don't know every Speedlight in the world, but I'm sure somebody's making stuff that don't have that. Also, because I'm sure the question will come up, if you are using a new camera with an older Speedlight, so let's say you switch from Sony to Sony from another brand, you might be able to use that older Speedlight from the other brand on your Sony camera. Typically, there's a center pin, and if the center pin is there, it will still fire. However, it will not work with TTL. And high-speed sync also won't work. Both of those things involve the flash and the camera communicating. And if they can't communicate, if they are not matched brands. So just bear that in mind. All right. Somebody just leaned against the door of my office for some reason. Just as a quick thing to go over what I'm using and the cameras I use to do most of this, although some of these pictures are older, so it could be different. I'm using the Alpha 7R5 and the Alpha 1. One of the cool things that started with the Alpha 7 IV and then the Alpha 1 and Alpha 7R5 is the 2 newest Sony Speedlights, the HVL F46RM and the HVL F60RM2, have a new feature where if it's mounted on the camera, the flash and the camera communicate in a way that if you're using TTL, it knows where you're focused and it can put out the right amount of light. So typically, if you're using TTL with a speedlight, it sends out a pre-flash. There's a little flash, it measures that amount of light, and then it sends out the real flash, and that's how it knows how much light to do. With those 3 new cameras and the 2 newest speedlights, it doesn't need to do that. So it skips that step, so it's faster. That's a very, very cool feature. In the past, if you wanted to use TTL, you would have to anticipate a little where ahead of when you wanted to shoot, because you would have that fraction of a second pause. And that's true with any flash that does TTL. But now with those 3 cameras and those 2 flashes, it eliminates that step. It's very, very cool. These are the Sony speedlights that are available now. I would recommend looking for something with an R if you're using Sony. If you're not using Sony, whatever flash system you're looking at, I would really recommend that you get something with built-in radios. The older technology was infrared, and it's much more limited compared to radio. So I'm using the 60RM2 and the 46RM. I also still have a 60RM, some 60RM1s and 45RMs. So 60RM2, 46RM, great wireless flashes. I also use the wireless commander, and if you have an older Sony flash, you can get the receiver. Oh, has in there twice. All right, so let's talk about speedlights. That's the stuff I'm using. That's the information that Sony has. Sorry, I'm just making sure I'm on top of any questions that come up. Understanding speedlights. So to start with, speedlights from any brand are going to have a pin pattern or something on the bottom. The really, really old speedlights had a single pin. You can see that pin in the bottom there. Sony speedlights have that series of longer pins at the top. That's for the multi-interface shoot. It's multi because it doesn't have to just be speedlights. It could be mics, for example, can communicate through that. So that's how Sony communicates between the camera and the flash, is through those pins. So it's a very fast communication, but you do want to protect those pins. Always put a shoe on it. If you're using a different brand, they just have different patterns of pins on the bottom, and that's how it communicates. If you're using Sony, there's a couple of things you're going to want to know in the menu system. It's going to default to fill flash. Fill flash is really just flash. If you just want generic flash goes off, it's fill flash. Slow sync. And most of these are going to apply to any camera, not just Sony. This is just where they are in the menu with Sony's. If you're shooting any brand, it's probably going to have these features. Slow sync is a feature that tells the camera that you're using a long shutter speed with a flash. So it understands that, can try and optimize for that. Rear sync is typically when you are using a long shutter speed with a flash, the flash fires at the beginning of the exposure, and then the rest of the exposure is ahead. Rear sync, it waits to fire the flash till the end of the exposure. And the reason for that is, let's say you're photographing something with action, somebody's running. If you use a long shutter speed with normal flash, they're sharp at the beginning and then they're blurry in front of them in the direction of movement. Whereas if you do rear sync, the blur feels like it's behind them and it feels more like what we associate with speed. You have flash compensation. What that is telling the flash to be brighter or darker. Typically, you would use that if you're using TTL. So you can dial that up or down in thirds of a stop. If you're using Sony speedlights and you're going to use flashes off camera, I've been told on other talks I've done that there is, I don't remember which brand, that one of the third-party brands that you could get, this feature needs to be off. But if you're using Sony speedlights or like Pro Photo Studio strobes with their Air remote, you want to turn wireless flash on. And then with the newer Sony cameras, if you're using Sony speedlights, you can control the flashes through the menu in the external flash set. So you can change it. You can make sure high-speed sync is on and off. You can turn ratio control on and off. You can set the flashes to manual or TTL. If they're on TTL, you can make group A brighter than group B, and then group C brighter than both of them. It gives you a lot of control. You do have that control, same thing on the back of your wireless commander if you have one, or on the back of your Speedlight if you're using one as a controller. But it is convenient to have it on the back of the monitor. You can look through the viewfinder and see it. It's a nice feature. So group flash, you can use the flashes as a remote release, all that stuff. You can adjust the power, depending on the flash, from full power to 256 or 128, TTL, all that stuff, ratios. If you are using a Speedlight, and I mentioned this at the earlier, that is not a Sony dedicated Speedlight. If you're using a Speedlight from whatever brand of cameras you moved from, and this is going to apply to, I think, all mirrorless cameras, but obviously I don't know all mirrorless cameras, so I can't say for sure. There's a setting on Sony's called Live View Display. You're going to want to turn that off if you're using a non-dedicated flash. The reason for that is typically because the exposure is going to change when you set everything for the flash. Maybe you want to be shooting at f16 inside. If you set your mirrorless camera to f16, it's going to show you what that exposure will look like, which will be very, very dark. Typically, you could turn setting effect off to negate that. If you put a Sony dedicated flash on the hot shoe, in the multi-interface shoe, and turn it on, the camera knows that flash is there and it turns this off automatically. Some people wish it didn't do that, but then you wouldn't be able to see. So I have this as a custom button on all my cameras. I just turn it on and off with one button press. So this is Live View Display setting effect on and off. So you can see, depending on what's happening, you want it off so that you can actually see. All right, so some of this may be rudimentary to some of you, but I try and be thorough. Flash sync speed. So sync speed is the shutter speed with which your flash will work properly. Most cameras, it's 2/50th or lower. It's going to depend on the camera. Check your manual, look it up. If your sync speed goes too high, so here, for example, I have a 200th of a second on the left, 1/320th of a second on the right. That black vertical line is the shutter going into the frame, because above 250th of a second, with this camera, the entire shutter is never open. It exposes sort of in a line like this. And so there's no way for the flash in a single pulse to expose the whole frame correctly. If you see that black line, you're either above your flash sync speed, or sometimes things just go squirrely, but that's what's happening. And this is true of any camera. If you're shooting with an alpha 1, and it's partly why I have an alpha 1, the sync speed can go to 1/400th of a second. There are cameras, for example, the old Pentax 6.7 film camera, that camera's sync speed was 1/30th of a second. Super, super slow. So it's just going to depend on your camera, but it's important to know. If you're using a flash with built-in high-speed sync and you go above your sync speed, it will just turn high-speed sync on typically. But when high-speed sync is on, you lose power. Because the way high-speed sync works is it's firing multiple times in time with the movement of the shutter. So it can't be firing at full power that quickly, so you lose power. If you're shooting at an eighth or 16th or whatever, you may never notice, but it would also depend on how fast your shutter speed moved. All right, so I mentioned alpha 1, 1/400th of a second sync speed, very, very cool. So I already talked about high speed sync. TTL versus manual. TTL is the camera and the flash communicating to output a certain amount of light based on what you're telling it the exposure is and the distance to your subject. Manual is you're telling the flash how much power to put out, and you don't care what it thinks. So typically, if I am running around with the camera and the flash is mounted on the camera, like if I was shooting an event, for example, I'm typically in TTL because I can't take the time to change things every time the situation changes. Right now I'm 3 feet from my subject, now I'm 6 feet, now I'm 9 feet, now I'm back to 4 feet. If I do TTL, it's going to give me a good exposure as all of that changes. If I'm in manual, it's going to be too dark or too bright, and I have some examples of that in a bit. On the other hand, if I'm in a controlled situation, I'm going to use manual because TTL could vary as my composition changes and the flash and the camera think things have changed. So is one right and the other one wrong? No, it just depends on what you need, but they both have different purposes and different uses. Guide number is a ratio of f-stop, including with plus ISO, to distance. It's not really that useful to get into the formula of the guide number, and I looked it up and I already forgot what it is. What's important to know is that the guide number tells you the maximum power of the flash relative to other flashes that are the same. So with the 60 RM2, the guide number is 60. So it is more powerful than the 28 RM, which has a guide number of 28, or the 46 RM, which has a guide number of 46, 32M or the 20M, both lower number, less power, higher number, more power. I wouldn't necessarily trust that to check between brands. If you were looking at, say, a third party and then at a Sony, I wouldn't trust that those two numbers were necessarily measured in the same way, but within a brand, it's very useful. All right, we already talked about flash control. Sorry, I put that in there twice. I'm going to go ahead and skip that. I knew I was going to find something. I knew I was going to find something that I missed, no matter how many times I go through. All right, so let's talk about camera settings. You're going to use a speedlight on location. Are you going to use aperture priority, shutter priority, program, manual, green auto? So what you're going to use is going to depend on what your goal is. So here, this is with the alpha 1, because it goes up to 400th of a second. This is an example of a situation where it kind of doesn't matter because it's so dark and there's no other information, that the only thing that matters is really the f-stop and the flash output. I have all the way from half a second to a 400th of a second flash on camera pointed at me in a dark space with a black background. All of those exposures look basically the same, right? The shutter speed didn't matter at all. The ISO didn't change. Nothing mattered. The flash output was consistent. The f-stop didn't change. So in certain circumstances, shutter speed doesn't matter. Same thing. So here, manual, upper left, aperture priority, upper right, shutter priority, bottom right, program, bottom left. You can see the exposures changed a little, but the f4 and ISO stayed the same. Shutter speed changed. In neutral background, black background situation where there's no light but the flash, it doesn't matter. On the other hand, that's very rare when you're on location, right? Most of the time when we're on location, we are somewhere where it is not pitch dark. So the shutter speed could matter. So here in the hallway outside my office, everything's at f4, ISO 100 with the alpha 7R5. Top row is using TTL flash. So the flash is setting the exposure based on the information I give it and the distance from the camera to the subject. On the bottom is no flash, same settings. So at a 2/50th of a second, shutter speed, sort of irrelevant. 1/25th, if you look just at me, not that relevant. Even 1/60th, 1/30th, no. 1/15th, 1/8th, and 1/4, you're starting to see that the ambient light is having an impact. It's also impacting the background. So if you want to see the space you're in, if that's important, that shutter speed is going to come into play. And you're going to have to find a balance between how much light output there is from the flash and how much of the background you want to see. Because if you go to the far right, the 1/4 or the 1/8, there's so much ambient light that it's affecting the color of my skin. And it's affecting the exposure in general. If I was doing this for real, that 1/15th, 1/30th, I feel like you get enough of the background to understand what's happening, but it's not impacting the exposure too much on the subject, which is me, because I'm around when I need to do a test. So hopefully that helps with shutter speed. And then we have, do you want manual shutter priority, aperture priority, or program? It depends. It depends on what your goal is. So manual, you're controlling everything. The flash can still be on TTL, but you know what shutter speed you want, you know what f-stop you want. I know people who shoot events, for example, who will put the camera on manual. I do this as well sometimes. They'll put the camera on manual, put the shutter speed on maybe a 60th or a 30th, so you get a little bit of the light in the background. Set the f-stop to f4 or 5.6, so you're getting a little bit of that, but it's still a shallow depth field, and just go crazy, and then let the flash adjust its output as needed. Typically, if I were shooting an event doing that, though, I would increase the ISO. Whoops. I would increase the ISO above 100. Shutter priority, you're setting the shutter. The camera's setting the f-stop, and it's balancing what f-stop it's going to set with how much output the flash is doing. It's trying to work all of that magic together. So here, I put it on 2/50th of a second. It was a 2.8 lens. It opened up all the way to 2.8 to try and get some of that ambient, because it doesn't know if the background is important or not. So it's going to try and bring some of that in. It couldn't open up more than 2.8 because it was a 2.8 lens. Aperture priority, I had it on 3.2. It opened up the shutter a lot to let that ambient in. Where a 1/13th of a second, that's letting in a lot of light. So depending on what you're doing, that may be too much. A 1/13th of a second, you're going to get some blur on your edges. You're definitely going to see some ghosting unless nothing's moving and the camera's on a tripod. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend aperture priority unless you're going for an effect. We're going to be talking about experimenting, or unless you really, really, really need that background. And then program is trying to balance everything. It also went down to a 1/13th of a second at f2.8. It was trying to bring even more light in. So which you're going to use depends on what your goals are and what you're trying to accomplish. I mostly use manual. I'll sometimes use program, but like here, I don't love that it went down to a 1/13th of a second. That's not what I want. So here we are. We've talked about all that. We're in aperture priority. Slow sync is on at f4 because it's aperture priority and it's a dark background. It did 0.4 seconds, ISO 200. You can see that we're getting some of the warmth from the overhead lights. We can see that it's a little blurry because it's a 0.4 seconds. But you can sometimes do cooler features with a slow sync and a long exposure. Here it is. I just have a flashlight just moving it around. It's like that famous Picasso thing. Right? So shorter shutter speed, longer shutter speed. You can see the impact it's having when you go too long. Now the light's starting to affect me. And this is what it looked like with no flash. And then let's talk about where you want your flash pointed. So the standard thing, you put the flash on the camera, point it at your subject, boom, it's lit, you're done. And there are people, especially early 2000s, that was very much a fashion thing. Several fashion photographers did that a lot. I'm not a big fan, but everything's subjective, right? They worked a lot. They made lots of money. People loved it. If you love it, fantastic. If you don't love it, don't do it. Just like anything else with photography. You like long lenses, use long lenses. You like short lenses, use short lenses. You like direct flash, go ahead. If you don't like direct flash, don't use it. So I'm not a fan of direct flash. I think it's a little harsh. So direct flash, direct flash. I like to bounce. If I'm going to use the camera or the flash on camera, I'd like to bounce. Again, if I'm in a situation where I'm shooting an event, I may not have that flexibility. So this is the flash bounce straight up. Straight up. This is the flash bounced up and back a little so that you're less likely, like here, there's a little bit of shadow under the eyes because the light's coming from directly above. If you bounce it back a little, it's a little more directional. So bounce flash back a little, bounce flash back a little, bounce flash off the wall, which is one of my favorites. Just point it at a light colored wall to the left or the right, bounce it off there. This starts to feel like lighting that was planned to me. Same thing here. Bounce flash off a surface to your left or right is my favorite. All right, let's talk about fill flash. So fill flash is using the flash, like I said, with Sony speedlights and cameras, they just always call it fill flash, the general flash thing. What you are essentially doing is taking something with traditional fill flash that is in the ballpark of what you want, and you're just adding some light to fill in the shadows. So this is me again. Don't worry, later there's pictures of people that aren't me. No flash, manual exposure, 5.6, ISO 200, 1/200th of a second. You can see my eyes are a little dark. There's no catch light. So this is direct flash, full power or TTL. Everything's on there. It fills it in. There's still some direction. It's a little harsh, but not bad. But one of the common things that people do is change the power of the flash a little. So earlier on, I mentioned the flash compensation, the flash exposure compensation. This is where that comes into play. So we have direct flash, just turn down one stop. So whatever the camera and the flash think is normal exposure, it's just putting out one stop less than that. So now it's filling in, but it's much less obvious that there's a flash. And I think more interesting. Then we've got direct flash boosting the shutter speed, which gives you a much darker background. This is where either high speed sync or a camera like the Alpha 1 with a faster sync speed matters. Exact same exposure inside. Direct flash with a long exposure with me moving. That's where you start getting ghosting. In the 90s in particular, a lot of people did this when photographing live music. It can be a fun effect. Sometimes you can do cool things with it, like that movement where I have a double ear, double face. Direct flash outside at night program. So outside at night with program, the background is so dark that the flash sort of said, forget it, or the camera said, forget it. You clearly don't want to bring in something that's so dark in the background. So it's just dark. Here's an example of me overriding it. So program manual, 60th of a second, 4 seconds. 4 seconds is obviously too long to handheld-ish. Depends. You've got optical steady shot in there, and depends on you and what your tolerance for ghosting is. Because even with the camera on a tripod, you can see there's some ghosting at the edges. Ghosting is where it's a little blurry as your subject moves. But now we're starting to bleed in that background. So often, when people are taking pictures outside at night, like you used to see before everybody started using cell phones, in New York City, you can look up at the Empire State Building and see people's flashes popping off. And every time I saw that, I thought, their cameras are just automatically putting on the flash because it's dark. It's not doing anything because they're pointing it at the city. There's no speed light. There's no on-camera flash that is going to light up the city from the top of the Empire State Building. However, if you're photographing your friend on the Empire State Building and you're trying to get the view in the background, then you could do something like this. Long shutter speed with a flash, get some of that ambient from the background in, light your subject. Another long exposure, but this is me moving in and out. Moving in and out some more. All right. So we talked about TTL versus manual. And I mentioned that TTL will adjust its exposure based on your subject distance, and manual does not. So top row is TTL, bottom row is manual. So you can see 3 exposures in a row. TTL on the top, it did a pretty good job exposing all 3 of them. Manual on the bottom, the left one's decent. The middle one's too bright. The one on the right's much too bright because the flash was set for the distance I was from the camera in the left. And then because it's manual, it's putting out the same amount of light and it doesn't know I'm moving closer to the camera. So it's overexposing because there's no way for it to do that because I told it, ignore what you think, do what I want. Situations like this, TTL is probably the answer. Same thing here, moving in and out, manual on the bottom, TTL on the top. All right, high-speed sync, we talked about that. Let's go into more depth. So high-speed sync allows you to use a shutter speed higher than your sync speed with a flash, with a speed light. So this is the Alpha 1 at a 40th of a second, no flash. I'm just moving my hand really quick like this. It's very blurry. Maybe you can tell that's a hand. Maybe you only know because I told you. Same exposure, 40th of a second, f8. With a speedlight off camera, boom. Now at least it's frozen my hand in a spot, so you can see it's a hand, but you've got a lot of ghosting because it's moving. So it's 40th of a second. It was not there for a lot of that exposure. There's lots of blur. Go up to an 80th, 1/60th, 2/50th. Even at a 2/50th, you can see there's some ghosting. 400th, there's a tiny bit of ghosting. Tiny bit. Changing the exposure a little. So I don't know if you can see, especially by my pointer finger, there's a little bit of ghosting. But now we're into high-speed sync. This is an 800th of a second. At this point, my hand's just not moving fast enough to see any ghosting. So even though the flash will freeze motion, as we saw in the earlier ones, it will freeze motion, but if the ambient is bright enough, that's still affecting the exposure and it will light whatever's moving the entire time it's moving. That's where high-speed sync is useful, especially outside. You can just increase your shutter speed to get the exposure you want. You know, you're photographing sports, maybe you want to be at 2,000th of a second to freeze somebody running. That's great. If you want to use flash with that, you need high-speed sync. 2/2500th of a second, not much of a difference. So here you can see 80th, lots of blur, 2/50th, some blur, 1/400th, tiny bit of blur, 2500th, no blur. All right, let's think about light position. So direct on camera, you can move the flash off camera, especially if you're using a radio flash. Control it from the camera. You're going to need some sort of transmitter. Could be another's flash, could be the transmitter itself. Move the camera to the light to the left. Not very interesting. If you discount the fact that it's a picture of me, a little more interesting. There's a shadow side and a highlight side. There's some shape. Putting the flash directly behind. A little too bright, a little too much. Changing the exposure, moving where it is a little bit better. Now we've got one, well, so this one and this one, there's a light on the front, there's a light on the back. Now we've got the light on the back, better exposure, and the light on the front is off to the side, still better. We've lowered the power, it looks better still, right? All right, now we're going to look at some real world pictures that I actually took that aren't of me, because I think it's a lot more interesting to look at pictures of other people. So no flash on the left, flash on the right. It's direct. You can see it's a longer shutter speed. We're getting that ghosting. So I've sort of talked about ghosting like it's a bad thing. It's not good or bad. It's a choice, right? Like anything. Ghosting can be cool. So one way that I really like ghosting is what it can do with hair. It can make it look like hair is moving. Like you can see her hair, the edges of it, there's a little bit of blur. Flash off to the side, gives it some direction. It feels much more interesting to me than direct. No flash. This is also an example where flash can be really useful if your subject is in the shadow and the background is brightly lit, like that street back there. Boosting the light is a good way to go. You can't just magically make the street darker or your subject brighter. You can make your subject brighter, which makes the street brighter. You can make the street darker, which makes your subject darker, or you can add light to one of them. No speed light on the left, speed light on the right, filling in those shadows, filling in under the eyes. A little bit more off to the side, which I tend to think is more interesting. Off to the side, and then no speed light, no speed light. This one's actually not bad, but speed light. So one thing, and I didn't do a good job here, that you want to be careful of is the height of your light. So you can see the light is basically the same level as her head. So the shadow from her nose and the shadow on the wall behind from her are even. It would have been probably better if I had raised the light a little bit so that it felt more like the sun coming down a little bit, not too much. but also every picture I've ever made could be better. No speed light on the left, speed light on the right. This one, I did a better job with height. You can see the shadows coming down from his chin. So coming up from the left and down. A lot of those were outside, inside just as good. So speed light here on the left, coming closer with an umbrella. So we haven't really talked about modifiers, but just about any modifier that you can put on any kind of light, you can put on a speed light. An umbrella is a great place to start. It's a good way to make a little bit more of a flattering light. It's very, very soft compared to the size of a direct, this front of a speed light's tiny. An umbrella can be huge. I have 7-foot umbrellas. So add an umbrella outside upstate. No light. Now we have a light on the left, lighting my subject there. It's hiding behind that tree on the left. Then I have another light in the background hitting the trees behind. So you can see how dark those trees are, the sides facing us. The two on the front, I want it dark because it helps frame it. If they get brighter, I think it's distracting. There's a light on my subject. There's another light so that the trees in the background get a little brighter as well. Heavy backlighting, adding some speed light. Just a little bit of light to the front. Another example where I like how everything back there looks. The sky's a little blown out, but with that backlighting, she's much too dark. We can't see her eyes. Just adding a little bit of light makes all the difference. You still get that dramatic effect of the backlighting. We're still seeing the shadows come towards us, which I think is cool. Here I'm using a little 12 by 16 or 12 by 18, no, 12 by 16 tiny softbox for speedlights. I think it's 12 by 16. Might be 10 by 12. Just on a pole, I have an assistant holding it up. Here I have a speedlight coming from the back. With that little softbox, you can see the highlight on his hair. I'm pointing at the screen like you can see my hand pointing at the screen. You can see the highlight on his hair and the back of his jacket. And then I have another light from the front with another very small softbox as the main light on him. You can see where even just a small modifier can make a big difference. Small softbox, small softbox. You can see another advantage of speedlights that I didn't talk about is because they're so light and portable, you can basically clamp them to anything. So you can see in the upper right, I have a speedlight with a small softbox clamped to that girder. I also have another one on the left. And then here I have one down the stairs, one on the left and one from the right. So the left is just doing a tiny bit of light. The main's on the left, the one on the right's doing that little bit of edge light. You can see them all there. Rim light on the left, umbrella with a speed light on the right. This is what it looks like with no flash. Sorry, not an umbrella, a small softbox. Same thing. Speed light on the left. You can see it there, just on a very tall light stand. It's on the far left of the frame, pointing down. Speed light on the right with a small softbox. Backlighting, which I'm a big fan of, often is just too dark, right? Like here, it's just too murky. Boost the exposure a little, add some speed light. Same thing here. You can see it clamped to the railing there. In New York City, you're not supposed to put a light on a light stand on the ground without a permit. So I clamp them to things. I clamp speed lights to things. Now, if a police officer comes up and tells me I can't do that, obviously I'm going to have to move along, but it's not touching the ground. So I would argue I don't need a permit. No speed light, speed light. Obviously much, much nicer. And even just that little soft box makes all the difference in the world. It's making the source of the light, 10, 15 times larger, which makes it softer. And then we've talked about ghosting and long exposures. We're going to talk about this more when I do experimenting. Sometimes it's fun to experiment. Sometimes it's fun to intentionally do a long exposure. This is just long exposure and zooming the lens while I shoot with the flash. So you get that motion effect. All right, so let's talk again. If you're going to submit pictures, which I hope you do, please submit not more than 3 pictures. Same slide as before, 1200 pixels on the short side, not more than 3000 pixels on the long side in JPEG, to eventspacereviews@gmail. And again, we're family friendly here, and we may or may not have time to get to everybody's work. All right, let's see if there are any questions. I'm just waiting to see if anything pops up. If Danny wants to feed me anything. In the meantime, how is everybody? Summer's starting to be here. It's nice. From Vimeo's question. So based on the flash modes you have used, is it possible that the perfect, in quotes, combination would be manual mode on camera to control background in conjunction with TTL to control subject light? So with the caveat that I don't believe that anything is perfect, I think that is a good way to approach it. Manual mode on camera, set your f-stop, your shutter speed, and your ISO, and then TTL so that when there's any variance between your subject distance to the camera, the TTL adjusts for that. Yes, mystery Vimeo person, I agree. That's what I would recommend for a lot of situations for a lot of people. Not all situations for all people, but it's very much a good place to start, yes. All right, let's see what other questions that Fred or Danny want to send me. Let's see. Do the pictures have to be portrait for the speedlights? No, I should have mentioned that. That's from Daniel Gomez. Daniel, thank you for bringing that up. Absolutely not. If you're using a speedlight, it can be a picture of anything. You can photograph a ladybug. You can photograph a flower in your garden. You can photograph a building you really like or a statue. It doesn't matter what it is. I mostly photograph people in portraits, so that's what I have to show. I actually thought about including some other stuff and then just didn't get to it. But the pictures that you submit absolutely do not have to be portraits. It can be anything. Thank you for asking the question, because I should have answered that, addressed that already, and I didn't. So thank you, Daniel. All right, let's see what else we have. Also, if you have things that you would like the event space to do, if there's stuff you'd like me to talk about in the future, or that you would like someone else to talk about in the future, reach out to them and let them know. You know, if you want somebody to talk about, I don't know, photography while parachuting, maybe somebody could talk about that. It's definitely not me. But I think if people don't know that you want to hear about it, it's not going to happen, or it's less likely to happen. All right, let's see. Any other questions? And it is very, very cool how much better flashes have gotten. That Vivitar 283, which was a Rockstar flash, I like my flashes now so much better. I should just have stories to talk about while we wait to see if any questions come in. Oh, here's one from YouTube. Does auto white balance affect the color temperature of your speedlight? It does not. Your speedlight is always going to be flash, which is roughly daylight. If you have your camera's white balance in incandescent or tungsten, it won't change the color that your speedlight is. It will just look very blue, because if you're in tungsten, that's what it would look like. Changing the white balance in camera won't affect the color temperature of your speedlight. Some speedlights, for example, the 60RM2, come with these little clip-on filters. There's an orange one and a blue one and a green one, I think. The green one is if you're going to photograph somewhere with lots of heavy green fluorescence, which is less common now, but fluorescence used to be very, very green all the time. Or if you're photographing somewhere that's incandescent, you can clip those onto your speedlight, so that will change the color of it. You can also just get gels. B&H has all sorts of gels you can buy. Just tape them on there. But if you want to affect the color of your speedlight, you have to do that with an external source. That looks like that may have been another Tony who asked that question. All right. All right, Danny, any other questions, or Fred? I don't know which of them is actually copying and pasting these questions. You can also, if you think of a question later, you're welcome to email me. I may not get back to you right away. If I don't, just email me again. We can also answer some questions next week when we go over the submissions. No more. All right. So I guess we're going to wrap it up. Thank you, everybody. I hope that was helpful. I know I go fast and I go over a lot. I just always think of more things to include. Have a good week. I guess it's Monday. It doesn't feel like Monday. Have a good week. And we'll see you all next time. Oh, wait, one more. Oh, thank you, Danny. Daniel, see you next week. All right, Danny, I guess we're done.